Good afternoon, YouTube. Welcome back to my channel, JPM.Cuisine. I'm back.
I was knocked down, heard the countdown through the haze in the face of defeat.
I'm back after a little break, getting back into the swing of things. Still have my COVID set up, so if you notice my table's a little wobbly, apologies for that, but right now I'm working from my studio. That's my full-time office for my job, my 9 to 5. As everybody may know, this is just a hobby for me. It's not my full-time profession to make YouTube videos and social media, but I do that as a hobby. And so because of COVID, I've had to make a little bit of adjustment to my studio where now I have a flimsy table. I'm trying to do my best to keep it from shaking, but unfortunately that is the breaks that we currently have with our situation in life. So apologies for that. I used the same table when I was doing the entertaining cleaver showdown video. Again, that was not a how-to or a excuse me. That was not a how-to or a video demonstration on how to instructional video, if you will. That was more entertainment and just testing those knives out, going full balls to the wall, if you will, on those knives to see exactly how they perform. Everybody wanted to do that. A lot of people I know, when you get those knives, you just want to wreak havoc with it. And so that was a fun video for that. But unfortunately, the video, people did notice that my table was a little wobbly, and so I had to downgrade, make room for a couple more pieces of equipment in my office so I can still do these. But hopefully when things clean up, we'll be able to, or when things clear up, we'll be able to expand and get my studio back to where it was. But unfortunately, we'll have to deal with it as is. So with that being said, today we're going to be taking a look at the Misen chef's knife. And this is the 8-inch chef knife. This was sent to me by Misen to review. It's been a while since I think they've released these knives. This is maybe like either the second or the third iteration. This current knife is using an Aus-10 Steel. I think it's still got the similar design. Maybe the handle or material on the handle may have changed a little bit, but we'll be talking about this one. I believe the first edition is the one that was reviewed by J. Kenzie Lopez Alt, and I think they advertised it as one of his reviews is saying this is the holy grail of knives. And so again, that was the first gen. This is I think the second or third gen, so it's a little bit different, maybe some minor adjustments to it. We'll give it a try here. I'm not sure what to expect on this knife, and so this is kind of an unboxing and a quick review just to tell you how I feel about it out of the box. And so this is kind of one of those more candid reviews versus an in-depth 4-month or after using it for a while. So I really want to see what my initial thoughts are. Let's go ahead and get into it. And so I'm just going to be cutting up a little bit of vegetables and stuff. It's going to make my office stink. Let's see. So the name comes from mise en place, which means to put things in place. This is sort of the train of thought or the mentality that you get into when you organize before a shift or so, when you're about to do some preparation. And so, cool little name. Again, they've been around for a while. A little bit of information on the knife here. You can see, you can pause there. But again, it's giving a little bit of information on how to grip the knife using a pinch grip, if you will. Washing it with warm soapy water. Drying after washing. This just helps prevent rust or any kind of staining on the knife. Never putting in a dishwasher. Dishwashers are a very harsh environment due to the heating and the drying elements within it, and so it's not necessarily the best environment for a knife. Most of the time they can hold up to it, but maybe not for a long time. And then there's a safety factor where if you're reaching into a dishwasher or in this case a sink full of water, you don't want to soak the knife in there because you may end up cutting yourself. And so we've got a tip protector here on the Misen. Oh, it feels very light. Just my initial thought pulling it out. And so I'm going to be very candid, tell you what I think about this. Just off the bat, I believe these retail for $65. So a little bit on the higher end of an entry level. And when I say an entry level, we're talking about like the Victorinox and the Mercer type knives. The very entry level would be sort of like a Millennia, which comes in at around $25. I think Akuma is there. Victorinox might just be tipping the scale there with their Fibrox knives, where they may go in at maybe the 30-40 range. And then of course Mercer has the Millennia, the Genesis, and the Renaissance line. And so this would be more along the lines of the Renaissance, or the higher end of the entry. At 65, it's a little bit probably like $15, $20 more than one of those knives, but let's see if the quality matches what you're gonna expect for that price range. So this is a sub $100 knife, and I know that, you know, in a lot of the forums and discussion, you know, typically the main recommendation is buy Victorinox, learn how to sharpen or learn how to use a Victorinox. After you tear that one up and you gain some experience with it, then you typically, if you're in some of the forums that I'm in, we'll see that the recommendation is to go immediately to Japanese production knives. So we're talking about Gyotos, we're talking about like Tajiros, things of that nature. And so kind of avoiding any of the Western style knives and some of those recommendations, but this, you know, is typically a Western style. It's maybe more of a Western style hybrid type chef's knife. Where we have sort of a stainless bolster, one-piece steel. This, I believe, is Aus-10 is what I believe they said. This looks like maybe a micarta type handle, or maybe a paca wood type handle. And so it's just, if it's paca wood, it's just a wood with a resin around it to give it that sort of wood look. It's still resilient, but typically with a paca wood, you'll see that due to the environment, wet and dry, humid type environments, you might see that the scales will either expand or contract just due to the moisture content in typically the air or after you dry it. And so what that will typically do, if you're not familiar, if you're new to knives, when you're looking at something like a paca wood or a wood style handle, when they shrink, you'll feel like a gap between the spine. And so anywhere that there's a metal matching up to the wood style handle, you'll typically feel sort of a gap that may change over time. And so that's typically what you see with that. If you're looking at more like a G10 or micarta style handle, those are fiberglass, and those typically do not react to environment. And so they'll stay true and you won't feel any kind of gaps. This, again, is new, haven't really used it. So it feels flush, everything feels kind of clean. We'll look at fit and finish, but nothing noticeable in terms of any kind of real adjustment or shift in that handle. So I'm thinking it's probably going to be more of like a micarta or so, but I'll find out, and I'll put all the details and specs in the description box below. Anyways, so let's go back and looking at the knife. So we got an Aus-10 steel, and typically Aus-10 is a Japanese style steel. It's typically a harder style steel. Then you have Aus-8, Aus-10, equivalent to sort of a high carbon German steel. But these are very typical. I think what you mostly will see is in earlier days, a couple years ago, you were seeing more Damascus. Everyone was trying to use the Damascus VG10 steel. Damascus is just a pattern that you see in the steel. The VG10 would be the core of the steel. And VG10 isn't necessarily a controversial steel in terms of the manufacturing, more along the lines of the availability. And so people will market that they use VG10 when they're not necessarily using a VG10 steel. And so it's easier to market the use of an Aus-10 or an Aus-8, and it's probably easier to acquire than using VG10. And so in that case, you'll see a lot of knives, if you follow them, specifically like with Strong and other companies like that, they switch from using VG10 or advertising VG10 to then using the Aus-8 and the Aus-10 steel. The X50 CRMO V15, very similar steel profile to the Aus-8 or so. And so that's just typically what you see. BD1N is an American style steel. And so I'm just going on a lot of different steels. Maybe not so much interesting. Let's look more into the knife, but just want to give you a little bit of background about why I think they use Aus-10 or why they market these things. And so you may see a little bit less and less VG10. Typically you want to look for a Japanese handmade or partially handmade knife when you're looking at VG10, since the type of steel. And all it means is just that it's a very strong core. It's usually clad between softer steel for sharpening, and so the edge is typically going to protrude. That's going to be the VG10. That's the core. That's what gives it that hard edge maintainability and hardness in terms of the steel overall, versus it being sandwich is what I'm talking about. And so this, I believe, is a single stamp steel, Aus-10. And you can see sort of the striations along. That's sort of the grinding or polishing finish there. And so very industrial look. Not necessarily shiny or mirror finish, but it's still a very nice finish. And so the profile looks really good. It's a nice sort of thin tip from the profile with a little bit of a rounded belly closer to the first third of the knife that kind of curves all the way out to the heel. And so what you see is you don't really have a flush last third of the knife. You know, you don't really have a last third that's flush. It still has curvature all the way through. And so it promotes more of a rocking action if you're trying to do herbs or something like that. And so it's very comfortable in that sense, versus having a boom, boom, like a Chinese style cleaver, which may be more flush. And so I've got a stainless bolster. I always check for the balance. Typically when you see a thicker bolster, it means that it's going to be not necessarily heavier towards the handle, but the weight distribution from the edge of the knife or from the tip of the knife to the handle is going to be a little bit further back in order to allow you to achieve the feeling of sort of a balance between. Some knives you may see that in order to adjust for the amount of metal that they use in the handle or the materials, the balance is shifted a little bit forward. What you may end up seeing, or what you may not want, is necessarily a tip heavy knife where the balance is, you know, sort of way out here. You'd have to balance out in order for it to, or sort of here, in order to get a good balance. That's where the majority, let me go back. And so when we're talking about the balance, we're talking about the even distribution of weight between the knife from the handle to the tip. And so in this case, the balance is more on the bolster, and it just means where it actually balances the knife. And it's kind of a preference thing, depending on how you like to use the knife or the way that you like the feel of the knife. And so depending on where you're most comfortable with the weight being, the balance is typically here. So the weight from here, from that bolster to the heel of the handle, is going to be evenly distributed between the tip of the knife and the heel. And so it's going to feel, in this case, maybe a little bit more handle heavy than blade heavy. When it's blade heavy, you know, typically you'll have to move out further towards the blade to try to give a little bit more weight distribution to the tip and the handle so that it'll balance out. And so with a handle heavy knife, you typically have a little bit more control in the hand, and it helps with a little bit of muscle fatigue depending on, you know, how long you're using the knife. But you want to have something fairly balanced so that it feels comfortable in your hand. You don't want something that's just constantly tip heavy. If it's tip heavy, then trying to do controlled cuts with it may not be as easy because you've got a lot of weight near the front of the knife. That makes it a little bit harder to maintain. Where if it's handle heavy, you know, the edge will feel very light and you may not get enough power when you're trying to cut. And so typically having a little bit more weight near the heel of the knife is going to allow you to do some pretty thick chopping, or powerful chopping, if you will. All right, so let's go ahead and get into some testing here. I've got an onion I've already split, rinsed it. It's sort of drying here, so you see it's kind of got some morph. And typically what I do when I test an onion is I just want to sort of feel how the knife, typically I'm using like the first third of the knife to cut into the onion. I do a horizontal cut, primarily because I want the slices or the dice, whenever I'm cutting in a dice, I want the pieces from the edge here to the middle to be the same sort of size. And so if I just were to do my my vertical cuts, this piece right here would end up being a little bit larger than these. And so that's why I would typically do a horizontal cut. And so with the horizontal cut, I am sitting down, so it's a little bit different. What I typically do is use the first third of the knife, try not to cut myself, and I just draw it across. And you're trying to hold the onion down, so you're putting a little bit of pressure on it, but depending on the sharpness of the blade and the thinning of the blade, you'll see how easily it will cut through. And so that's sort of the first test. If you've got to come a little bit further towards the middle of the knife to get the cut without cutting yourself, it's kind of a testament that the knife might be a little bit thicker, have a thicker edge or a thicker width on the blade, or it might be a little bit dull. And so trying not to cut myself. Again, I'm doing it on camera. You just want to be careful you don't cut into yourself if the tip's very sharp. In this case, it doesn't feel as sharp as it could be. And so out of the box sharpness is kind of a controversial topic. A lot of people, especially if you're experienced with knives, won't worry about out of the box sharpness, because you'll typically get the knife and you'll sharpen and hone it as you need. And so it's not necessarily a test of the full sharpness or performance of a knife, but in some case I look at it as a quality control component of manufacturing and sharpening, because the last thing that they do when polishing and sharpening a knife before they distribute it and box it is to sharpen the knife. And so I want to make sure that it is sharpened well from the factory, just to sort of get a glimpse or to kind of get an understanding of what their manufacturing process and attention to detail during the manufacturing process is. And so for me, it's not necessarily as sharp as I'd like it. And just using the tip, I'm not going all the way through. As you can see, if it's tip heavy, you'll get a little bit more strength on that tip. Since it's a little bit more handle heavy, it's going to be a little bit harder. But it should just glide through. And then when you hear a loud bang on the board, that typically indicates that you're having to use a little bit more force to cut the knife or cut with the knife. And so those initial cuts are a good indicator of the sharpness of the knife and sort of the thickness of the knife, whether or not it's something that is going to be a great performing knife. And so polishing a knife will help with that, sharpening a knife, of course, and then the profile of the knife, how it tapers from the spine towards the edge itself, is a big indicator of quality and performance. And so in terms of a chef's knife, a Western style chef's knife, this knife isn't as sharp as I'd like for it to be, but I can fix that myself. But out of the box, if you're new to cooking and you're looking for a knife that's, you know, straight out of the box, ready to use, this is typically, you know, a skill that you may have to pick up, is learning how to hone and sharpen your knife after you purchase. Sometimes you'll get a knife that's perfectly fine out the box, and so it's okay. It feels the balance again is more handle heavy here in this instance, and so it cuts okay. It's not very sharp out of the box, not razor sharp as I'd like it, but it still does a decent job. Fairly consistent cutting. I'm not feeling any kind of warping or any kind of issues with the tip being off or out of alignment, and so I think it's fairly decent. Now we're going to get my overall reaction of this knife in comparison or in relation to the price of the knife. Remember, we're talking about a $65 knife out of the box, and so I'm gonna tell you whether or not I think the initial value is there based on sort of the feeling. And the handle feels really good in the hand right now. I kind of like it. This is more of a classic style. It's a 2 rivet versus a 3 rivet. But it's a little bit smaller profile. Doesn't have a really big belly on the handle, that contour that you typically will see where you grip in. And so for the most part, when you're using a knife, if you're using a pinch grip, depending on the size of your hand, you're only using like the first half of the edge anyways. The heel, the palm of your hand is what's going along the heel of the edge that's allowing it to get that force. And so typically that's what you'll see. So we'll just do some slicing. It's not a bad knife. It performs very well. I mean, even though it can be a little bit sharper. It's not a big deal. I think out of the box quality control seems to be okay. All right, so let's move that out of the way. Give it a little wipe down here. Okay. All right, we'll get into a tomato. And I'm not gonna do any of the slicing that I used to do. I'm just gonna cut into the tomato and see how it feels. So there's a little bit more unripe tomatoes. What is it, October? And so we're not looking at necessarily some of the ripest. It's a little bit of firm skin. Ripe is going to be a little bit softer, sometimes a little bit harder. Firm skin is going to give you a little bit of an easier cut, if you will, just because it's more taut whenever you're trying to cut into it. And so the same thing when you draw our knife using our tip. Just looking for sort of control, how it feels. And so it's not too bad. I think it's a 15-degree angle on the edge that they put out of there. And so it's not too bad. It cuts decently enough, not a lot of pressure required. Push cut, pull cut, not necessarily a chop down, a straight cut. As you see, if I try to push down with a knife, it's going to do more of an indention and push the tomato versus doing a more of a drag on it or a push on it. And so if you're wanting to cut with this knife, it's not going to be sort of razor sharp where you can just take the knife, and as you see in probably some videos where they just push down on it and they can get a good cut, but it's all right. I don't really expect to do that too much. You know, you've got to probably polish it like 10,000 grit to get something close enough to what you're looking for that. So I don't know if you're the same way, but you know, growing up as a kid watching, you know, sort of cartoons and things about knives, you always see them using a knife to split metal. And so you always wonder, you know, in the back of your mind, if knives will ever be sharp enough to sort of split metal. And it's all fantasy, so not too bad. But it feels pretty good. Let me cut a little bit more tomato here. Just to see, maybe I'll just do a little bit more slicing here. So it doesn't feel bad. It's very comfortable in the hand. I don't think it's necessarily as comfortable as my Renaissance that I typically use. The profile of the edge is not bad. The right here is probably the sweet spot of the knife versus the tip, just because it's closer to where the weight is balanced. And so it feels really good here. It's got a nice profile on it. It's not too tall. It works very well. I'll save my comments for the value at the end, but so far performance-wise, I'm not displeased with it. I think they were again claiming it as the holy grail of knives. I don't even know what that means. Talking about the holy grail, you know, does it grant life? I don't know. Is it the last knife that you'll ever need? Knives last a long time, as long as you take care of them. I've had knives that have, you know, even a $7 Kiwi can last, you know, depending on how long you use it or how often you use it, it's typically will be okay. So I don't see knives typically fall apart unless they're really poorly manufactured. Wood handles specifically, when you don't take care of those, you know, they'll split and break. Plastic handles, polymer style handles would typically do that as well. Especially if you put them in the dishwasher, just expect the rivets and the material to sort of shrink away from each other or separate. And so you'll see those start to come apart. And so that's a big thing. Right now this feels very solid in terms of construction. So we'll just cut through a grape. I'm not going to do anything fancy. I'm just getting more things to cut through. Honestly, it feels like there is no grape. Excuse me. Honestly, it feels like there is no grape there when I'm cutting. So it's very, the weight of the knife is doing a lot of the work on some of these tasks. So, you know, an idea if you're cutting like a shallot or garlic or something like that, it's not too bad. And then sort of something with a little bit of a thicker rind. Looking at the lemon here, it's not too bad. Mostly, you know, one of the true tests would be like cutting into cabbage or butternut squash, because the rind's very thick on that. In this case, you'll see we're cutting through seeds, and so it's fairly sharp. My cuts aren't very accurate. I'm not even looking at where I'm cutting, honestly. And so I'm not trying to get an accurate cut. I'm just trying to feel how the knife cuts into the fruit here. And so it feels not too bad. Again, this is very heavy towards the handle, even though the balance is right on the bolster. And so trying to get a cut into a lettuce skin, or yeah, the skin of a lettuce. The skin of the rind of a lemon it's a little bit more work, okay? And so you'll want to be able to cut using the back end of this knife. And so tip work may not be ideal for this knife, but as a workhorse, it seems like it'll be okay if you're doing a lot of chopping. Not necessarily fine, delicate work, but it's all right. It's a decent knife. Okay, so let's go ahead and transition here to my thoughts, initial thoughts, sort of final thoughts, summary of what I think about this knife. Now, at $65, I kind of think they're pricing their stuff on the high end, even though it's an entry level. They're really bumping up close to some of those $100 knives, and even though the profiles of a Gyuto and a Japanese style knife compared to a Western style chef's knife, they're kind of getting very similar today. It's hard to tell or distinguish between the feel of them unless you're like completely experienced or you've been using those knives for such a long time. You'll see Sentokus that also exist on the market and things of that nature. And so depending on what your style of cutting is or what you're typically trying to accomplish, you'll see a lot of difference in terms of the feel. But for entry level, you won't notice it as much. What you'll typically notice is when you're trying to do certain cuts, like with this one, the tip work is not the strong part. The strong part is more of the chopping using this part of the knife here. And that's where a lot of the cutting is going to take place. And so when you're using this knife, if you're trying to do tip work with garlic and things of that nature, you might use a different knife, like a paring knife or utility knife or something else. And so in that case, for me, it doesn't feel like it's an all-in-one type knife. It's not necessarily, I would still want to use a different knife. Most of the time, you're still going to want to use more than one knife. And so it's okay in that regard. But in this case, if you're talking about this as the knife to end all knives, it's not that. Unfortunately, it's not that. It is a very comfortable knife. I like the handle. I like the styling of the knife itself. But honestly, I think 65 is kind of the high end. I would probably pick something else. Dowstrong makes a Gladiator series. I believe that comes in at that price, maybe a little bit cheaper as well. They've got a much thicker, heavier profile, heavier knife. And so if you're looking for something light and nimble, this might be okay. If you're looking for a price savings, I always go to the Mercer Renaissance with the scallops that typically has a very rounded edge. It's heavy enough where the tip work's typically okay. The handle is very comfortable. They use a, what is it? I can't remember off the top of my head, but it's a DuPont style handle. It's manufactured by DuPont. I'll remember it probably when I'm editing this video. So my apologies for that. I can't remember what it is right now. But in terms of the handle, it feels very comfortable. Not as comfortable as that rounded belly. So this is really where we start to get into more preference type things. But it's not too bad. I don't necessarily think it's worth the 65. I think they should price it down a little bit lower. Between 40 and 50 might be okay. But I think, they've got the name, they're trying to establish themselves, and so it makes sense. Maybe that's what the manufacturing costs are. It doesn't look like a typical knife that you'll see out of a high production plant. It doesn't mirror some of the other knives in the sense of, with the style of the handle and the style of the edge, but it's kind of unique in that sense. So I don't think it's a bad knife. I think it's a pretty good knife. I don't necessarily think this would be the one that I'm going to reach for immediately, Bo. And so, but if you like sort of this profile and you like the name, I don't think you're going to be disappointed with this knife. But I think for my money, I could probably find some better deals or options out there. And I mean, you're not that far off from spending $100 on something maybe a little bit better. For me, if you wanted to go up, you can even look at the, I always say Mercer, but those are the ones that I have always tested and been using a lot. But their MX3 line is a very good knife. It's a VG10 Sanmai, which is 3-layer. And so I like those knives a lot. Those are kind of high end. I don't really use them very often, so I stick to more of this type of knife. And for me, I think a Millennia, if you're entry level, Millennium or Victorinox or even the Genesis are probably some really good pickups for you. All right, well, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I know it's a little long-winded, a lot of explanation here. And so I'll probably leave you a point where you can fast forward if you just want to see the knife in action. But thank you guys for watching and sticking with me. Hopefully we'll get some more content out there. I've got to see if I've got some more knives that I can review for you. If you've got any recommendations, leave them in the comments. I'll see if I can pick something up and give it a test. I'm really wanting to try out a Tajiro on my channel, and so we'll see. But anyways, thank you guys for watching. Thanks for sticking with me, and we'll see you in the next one.